Welcome to this episode of Midlife Men with me, Philip Briscoe. Today is a bit different. Today we're talking about the menopause. So for all of you out there who perhaps don't really understand what the menopause is, what is your partner, girlfriend, even colleague going through? How can you help? What can you do? Can you help? But my guest today is Andrea Newton. Andrea is a trainer, a speaker, an author, and she also talks a lot about mental health and the menopause. So, Andrea, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So, why don't we start by maybe you could introduce yourself, but then maybe also talk about your experience with the menopause and how you've got to what you're doing today.
Yeah, sure. And it's really my experience that makes me want to engage as many men as possible in this conversation, Philip. So I'm really grateful to you for giving me the opportunity. Unfortunately, we often think of menopause as simply just a time in the life when periods stop and women might have a few hot flushes and night sweats. And actually, my experience and the experience of many other women, in fairness, was actually the negative impacts that menopause had on our mental health, which is especially why men need to know, because if your mental health as a woman isn't in a good place and you're in a relationship, be it married, partners, team members, line managers, it's just worth as many men as possible knowing that it is a lot more than hot flushes and night sweats.
Because there's even a bit of I don't know if it's a particularly British thing, but there's almost a bit of humour around it, isn't there? When people talk about the menopause. And I guess what we're going to talk about today is, in fact, there's humour in everything, but actually it's not that funny.
Yeah, there is. And, it's probably humour or banter, as we like to call it, that has actually taken a number of employers to tribunals of late. So even though we tend to associate the humorous, woman in a t-shirt in the middle of winter, standing by an open window with a fan in her hand, we tend to think of it in that way, but there is actually a very serious side to it. And from my own experience, my mental health was so affected that I actually made a plan to end my life. And what I now know is that I am not alone, and that actually many other women will go through challenges of that nature. In fact, it's said that as many as 10% of perimenopausal women will actually have thoughts of suicide due to the roller coaster of hormones that's happening around that time. And also, there's lots of statistics that show that the issue is much, much wider and much, much bigger than perhaps that humour might suggest. And so I'm a woman on a mission to get as many people informed and aware. It's not only about looking after the female in your life, but from a man's perspective, which, I know is what your podcast is aimed at. It's about recognizing the impact that can have on relationships, the impact that can have on sexual intimacy, the impact that can have in terms of the divorce rates during this time. So it is a lot bigger than perhaps that so-called humour would sometimes let us believe. Yeah.
So what should men look for? Because I guess, through ignorance, you feel quite helpless. And, and often it's a territory that you don't feel comfortable even, straying into. So, where do you start as a man or a partner, a friend, a brother, husband?
An innocent passerby, anybody who happens to be around. Yeah, absolutely. I think where you start is actually recognizing that it's a perfectly normal, natural human transition. And it is something that will affect 51% of the population directly. But chances are 100% of the population indirectly, dependent on the severity of the symptoms. And so for a man, I think it's worth understanding, just the basic information around it. You certainly don't need to be an expert. You don't need to be able to, score 10 out of 10 in a pub quiz. But it's just about realizing the basic stuff, such as in the UK, the average age for menopause for a white female is age 51 years. And that date is simply the date that signifies 12 months previously without any menstrual bleed. However, the bit that we often overlook is that until we get to that point, the hormones are on basically a massive roller coaster ride for, on average, 4 years prior to the menopause. But in some cases, it can be as long as 12 years. And during that time, what's happening is hormone levels are fluctuating up and down, and it's the fluctuation that causes the issue. And so what men may notice is perhaps a change in mood, change in energy levels. It might be that your team member, your partner, your wife is a little bit more tetchy than usual, perhaps a little bit forgetful. And again, we joke about things like brain fog, but it's if you're, for example, a woman in the workplace and you're experiencing that brain fog where you just can't find the words that you're looking for, not only can that be embarrassing, but that can also be career ending. And many women actually consider whether to give up work because of the cognitive effect, especially that those perimenopausal symptoms can have. So just for men to understand that there are 34 symptoms of the menopause, basically head to toe, and that the menopause affects all our major systems. So it can affect brain health, cardiac health, digestive health. It certainly has an impact on the major organs, the liver, the kidneys, the heart, etc. Because the key thing that's happening is the hormones that are rising and falling and eventually petering out are hormones that are not just required for sexual reproduction, but hormones that are required for the brain, the heart, stomach. We actually have more than 300 bodily functions that are reliant on that steady source of hormones. And actually, you kind of doesn't take a genius to work out if those levels start to fluctuate and all those different body systems are not getting the hormones they need. Absolutely. Mood, behavior, insomnia, vasomotor problems. So the whole thing with temperatures and sweating and flushes. Heart palpitations is another common symptom, again, because of the heart needing that estrogen supply. So I guess what I'd like men to realize is that there's a lot more to this than they perhaps immediately appreciate. And that it can affect everything from, sort of thinning hair at the top of your head to, aching joints around your feet. Every single bodily function that's affected by those hormones.
So what can men do to help? Or rather, what should we say? What shouldn't we say? As a kind of, what's the guide, if you like? I know that one size doesn't fit all, but just some useful practical suggestions.
Okay, I think there's a couple of things. I think, first of all, for men to be better informed so that they realise what's going on and why, in some cases, perhaps there is such a change in the person that they're thinking of, perhaps in their symptoms. The second thing, in terms of what men need to say, and this is perhaps a little bit tongue-in-cheek, why I've named my latest book, Could It Be Your Hormones, Love? Because that is definitely a question that I would want men to be comfortable to ask. However, to ask it at the right time, with the right tone of voice and in the right context, so that you don't risk getting your head ripped off. Okay? So could it be your hormones, love? And other questions that you might want to ask a menopausal woman really just to start the conversation and start the conversation from a place of concern, not from a place of judgment or criticism. I'm worried about you. What I've noticed is that is the easiest way to open up a conversation. Or, if you pick up on that person telling you that perhaps they're struggling, I'm really struggling. I don't know what's wrong with me. Okay, talk to me about what's been going on. Have you spoken to anybody else about this? And that is a perfect, could it be your hormones, love conversation. As long as that question is asked in the right tone of voice with very positive intent. Please do not ask that question at 3 a.m. when we're both tetchy from lack of sleep, where I'm sweating like a marathon runner in the desert wearing a fleece. Now is not a good time for that conversation. So choose your moment at a time when we can both have a grown-up conversation about something that perhaps might feel a little bit uncomfortable.
Do you find, or are some women unaware what's happening to them? Are they not aware that the symptoms, and you said, if it's happening years in advance, perhaps they don't know. And then you're both, if you're in a relationship, you're in a partnership, then you're both in the dark.
Absolutely. And, that is one of the biggest challenges. I think as recently as 2021, some research was done where more than 80% of women said they had very little or no knowledge and understanding of perimenopause. And if you think about it, perimenopause is quite a new word to our vocabulary. We've only just got used to talking about menopause, and now we want to talk about perimenopause. And peri is the Greek word for about or around. So basically it's the time around that menopause date. But yeah, more than 80% of women themselves weren't very clued up. And if you think about it, the system doesn't teach us. When we're at school, we get lessons in biology about puberty and periods and how to not get pregnant, hopefully. And then when we leave school, if we do get pregnant, there's then a whole plethora of information out there. There's books, there's magazines, there's all sorts of stuff where women can access knowledge and information, and I'm sure as a father yourself, you're familiar with that process where you can get that book that tells you what should your kidney bean be doing today, how big is it, what's happening now. But once you get past those procreative years, if you like, nobody comes along and says, oh, excuse me, let me tell you about the menopause because that's coming next and you need to be aware. And there's actually a campaign at the moment going to Parliament that's asking for women, once they reach the age 40, 45, that kind of education, that kind of medical appointment starts to happen. Because we have seen some fairly tragic circumstances where women have been misdiagnosed. Because that's the other missing piece in the jigsaw, Philip, that GPs are not routinely trained in the menopause. In fact, as many as 40% of UK universities don't even have menopause on the syllabus for medical graduates. And it's only from 2024 that will, in effect, be something that is routinely covered. And, I'm not here to bash GPs because if nobody's taught them, how are they supposed to know? But it seems a bit silly that a condition that affects 51% of the population isn't a routine area of study. And especially as we now know that it can actually lead to suicides, it definitely is something that, we do need to be paying more attention to. So women don't know, GPs don't know, so somebody needs to. So maybe this is where we turn to the men in our lives and say, come on, be the cheerleader, be the expert, step up.
So I guess there's no such thing as a typical menopause. I'm guessing that every woman is different, every individual is different. But, how long, does it take? How long on average, is someone going through this process?
So the lead up, as I said, is on average 4 years, but in some cases 10 to 12 years. And then once the day of the menopause arrives, i.e. 12 months without any menstrual bleed, We then are post-menopausal, and nothing changes. We don't suddenly find a cache of hormones that were hidden. We are now without those hormones. And that is something that's then lifelong. What we know tends to happen is the symptoms tend to, sort of peter out over time. But again, they can last for as much as 6 years post menopause. And that's why more and more medical professionals are now pushing for HRT, because actually what we know about HRT, or hormone replacement therapy, is not the shock report of the early 2000s, which was a badly researched piece of information. We now actually know that HRT can actually have positive health factors, not just around those the menopause, but also when it comes to things like osteoporosis, when it comes to things like cardiovascular disease, when it comes to things like dementia. For example, twice as many women are diagnosed with dementia. So there's some great research looking at actually, could that be to do with those hormones that, peter out during menopause? And if so, by a woman being on HRT, there are obviously health benefits. The other thing that we do need to mention, because we've only talked about, if you like, what you might call the natural menopause. So when a woman reaches that stage naturally, because we do also need to be mindful that some women can have what we might call a medical or a surgical menopause. For example, if a woman has to have a hysterectomy, or has her ovaries removed, or indeed undergoes any treatment, for example, chemotherapy, because that can bring on the menopause sooner. Basically removing or any damage to the ovaries will cause that surgical or medical menopause. So, it really is something that's perhaps a much bigger subject than we necessarily first thought. And even though the average age for a Caucasian woman in the UK is age 51, there are actually 1 in 100 women who will go through menopause in their 40s. 1 in 1,000 will go through it even earlier than that. And actually, just recently, I read a case where a young girl who'd literally gone through puberty had then, in her teenage years, gone straight into menopause, because it's basically relying on our biological system that we have from birth. So on average, age 51, with everything that goes around it. But as I said, there are other situations and circumstances where it can happen at a much younger age and overnight. So you don't have that roller coaster, that lead up to it that you would have if it was a natural menopause.
And, you've talked about the physiological signs and symptoms, but then also the psychological ones. I wonder if we could talk a bit more about, the psychological impact that it has on women. How much, for those women that have, the extremes where they are having suicidal tendencies, what is that a combination of the two? Drilling a bit more into the psychology behind it.
Absolutely. And this is the area that I am particularly passionate about, given my own lived experience and also the professional work that I've been doing for many years. So one thing that we need to understand is the brain has estrogen receptors. Now, those receptors are not there for ornament or decoration. The brain has estrogen receptors because it needs estrogen to function well. It also needs progesterone. Progesterone is important to the calming of our parasympathetic system, so our nervous system. So, for example, let me just give you a tiny example so that makes sense. If a woman experiences stress, as with a man, that cortisol and adrenaline are released. Yeah. And that's what creates that anxiety. What your listeners may not know is that it's the hormone progesterone that will typically calm that impact and therefore help us to then relax and de-stress. Now, if you know that progesterone is one of those hormones that's in decline during perimenopause, immediately you start to appreciate the stress effect for a menopausal woman because the hormone isn't there to calm it. So I actually believe that menopause starts in the brain. I actually believe that through the reading and the research that I've done, that we will tend to experience those symptoms at a head level far sooner. And that can be anything from, as I said, that brain fog where you can't quite find the words. It might be memory. You might struggle to retain information. So again, using the example of a woman in the workplace, perhaps being introduced to a new software system and is suddenly finding herself having to ask the same question over and over. It's not that she's stupid. It's that simply that ability to retain information is being negatively affected in the brain. Other issues at a head level, and again, this one is often the subject of banter when you can't quite find the right word. For some reason during menopause, nouns go missing completely and you just don't know what that thing is called anymore. So, sometimes that comes out, and obviously that can be quite funny if you look at it in that way. But if you actually understand and appreciate that what's going on at a far deeper level is that the brain isn't quite firing on all cylinders because it's not being nourished and fed by the hormones it needs. Now, obviously, the other issue that we have there is the impact that it has on serotonin, which I'm sure your listeners will be aware is to do with mood and especially, with positive mood. And so if those serotonin levels are affected, as they can be at this time, things like low mood, depression, an increasing number of women reporting anxiety who've never experienced anxiety at any point in their lives previously. And that anxiety can then have some quite significant knock-on effects. I'm aware of women who've left work. I'm aware of women who've stopped driving because they're too anxious to simply get behind the wheel of a car. And those kind of behaviours, as I'm sure you'll appreciate, can significantly impact not only that person's lifestyle and way of being, but that can also start to impact on things like self-esteem, self-worth, and then create tension in relationships. Because if you're my husband and you've no clue what's going on and all of a sudden I don't want to drive, I don't think I'm capable of doing my job, I worry about, where are the children? Why aren't they home? Because typically they're teenagers by this point or slightly older. So you can see why it can cause a lot of tension in relationships, as well as a massive impact for a person's self-esteem, self-belief, self-confidence, self-worth. And then if we also consider, sorry, I'm on a roll now. And if we also consider that at that time in life, I mentioned there perhaps about having teenagers or older children, perhaps children going off to university, and you've got the whole change of life that brings on, that whole empty nest syndrome. Women who perhaps in their late 40s, early 50s are at the pinnacle of their career, perhaps they're responsible for a team, perhaps they're responsible for a whole department, the stress that goes with that. And let's not forget that lovely phrase, the sandwich generation, whereby we're at an age now where we're looking after those older children, but we also find ourselves caring for elderly relatives at that point. So that sandwich generation can be really stressful. And I absolutely get that a lot of men will have those same challenges. But again, statistically, it still falls to, in most cases, the woman of the house to take care of those responsibilities, those caring duties. So in answer to your question, I personally think it's a combination of both. I think we've got stuff going on internally with that hormone imbalance, but we're also often leading quite busy, quite stressful lives where actually our own self-care is a long way down the list of priorities. And that is often why we don't notice, because we'll say things like, oh, I'm just a bit busy at the minute. No, there's nothing wrong with me. I've just got a lot going on. What do you mean I'm forgetful? Well, I'm bound to be, aren't I? I'm juggling all of these things. I was even in a situation where my period stopped and they put that down to the stress that I was undergoing at that time, when actually in hindsight, I was perimenopausal and needed some help. So, in terms of why do I think it starts there? What are the psychological, the emotional impacts? Hopefully that gives you a taste for what can happen. And as I said, in the risk factor for suicidal thoughts increases by a factor of 7 during this time. And if you look at the Office of National Statistics numbers, you'll see that the most significant number of female deaths by suicide is between the ages of 45 and 49. I don't think that's a coincidence. I think there's just so much going on internally and externally that leaves a woman, potentially feeling hopeless and worthless. And that's before we kick in with the medical bias, where more than 80% of women suggest that they don't get listened to by medical professionals. There's a whole piece of work that's been done there with the Women's Health Initiative. And again, this is a part that men can play, to be that cheerleader, to encourage us to ask for the help we need, to challenge perhaps when the GP says, oh, you're not old enough for menopause, because actually they've never studied it. They've got no idea about it, and women will need to advocate for themselves. And that is definitely a key part for men to play during this chapter.
So really helping look out for signs, providing support, making sure that the load is spread. And I was interested, you talked a little about the divorce rate during this period. What are the sort of statistics around that?
Okay, so it suggests that this during this period of time, say between 40 and 59, during that period, divorce rates increased significantly. And actually, what the some recent research done by a law firm tells us is that 62% of divorces are instigated by menopausal women. And again, I think that is a combination of factors. I think there is potentially the debilitating effect that symptoms can have. I think there's also increased risk of tension and stress in relationships because, as I'm sure you're aware, things like sexual intimacy can be affected because of the menopausal symptoms and the impact that lack of hormones can have, both on a woman's libido, but also on the vaginal dryness, a condition that means that intercourse is potentially excruciatingly painful. So obviously, sort of bedroom intimacy can cause issues in relationships. And I've certainly heard of a number of cases where people have been accused of perhaps having affairs because they haven't wanted to engage in intimacy. And it's, again, it's down to that hormonal imbalance. We also know, though, and let's be honest, maybe it's a bit of a Thelma and Louise moment. Maybe women get to the point where they think, do you know what? This is my second spring, which is what Chinese medicine refers to menopause as. And I don't want to spend my second spring in a situation where I'm just not living to my full potential. So maybe I am just going to walk out the door. But I know plenty of women for whom a apartment overlooking the coast with solo occupancy that doesn't take children or pets has become a bit of a dream. So beware, be very aware.
So thank you for that. So what help and advice, if you wanted, what other resources are there that are available?
So clearly, I have to say that the most important resource for men to get hold of is my book, Could It Be Your Hormones, Love, which I've actually also produced in Kindle and Audible. So you've no excuses, chaps. You can be listening to it in the privacy of your car on your commute. You can stick your little earbuds in while you're out walking the dogs and actually, get more comfortable with it, because I've written that book specifically for men. In terms of other resources, I would heartily recommend the Balance Menopause website, which is funded by an organisation called Newton Health. Dr. Louise Newton is one of the leading lights in the current menopause research. And in fact, Newton Health are funding a PhD at Liverpool University looking at hormonal depression. Is there a difference between clinical depression, hormonal depression? Is that why things like PMS, postnatal depression, menopausal depression are more significant? So Balance Menopause is a fantastic website. And I would also encourage any woman who wants to keep track of her symptoms to download the Balance app, which is a fantastic little app, free of charge. Have it on your phone and it'll help you get your head around what's going on. So there's a lot of resources. Obviously, things like the British Menopause Society, there's good information on there. And one thing that I would strangely recommend is that women go to the NICE website, so the National Institute for Health and Clinical Excellence, and actually download the guidelines for menopause. Because so many women are fobbed off with a blood test that actually tells you nothing. And if you look at the NICE guidelines for diagnosing menopause, it suggests that doctors now need to focus on the symptoms and the impact it's having, not on a single blood test that it doesn't contain a great deal of value. So tons of resources out there, and my website, inherrightmind.com, there is actually a downloadable document of really useful resources that includes websites, books, podcasts, a whole heap of information. So there is no excuse, gentlemen. We need to top up our knowledge tank.
Right. Okay. We'll put the link on in the episode description as well. So then in summary, Andrea, then, so, what's the advice then for somebody who is, near to either, emotionally, partner, wife, or at work, or just, just a friend, what should you be doing? What should you be to improve your ability to support those people? But also, helping to understand why it might be happening.
I would say my best piece of advice is get comfortable with the uncomfortable. Start to learn, understand, become more aware. If you're in a workplace where they are sensibly offering menopause awareness or they've got a menopause friendly policy, get involved, understand it. If you are a husband or partner of someone who currently you wonder whether this is what's happening for them, do your homework, do some research, and create an opportunity to have a really useful conversation. I fundamentally believe that conversations can change relationships. Conversations can save lives. So get comfortable with the uncomfortable and get talking about it, please.
Brilliant. Thank you, Andrea. That's fantastic. I really hope that, people listening to this certainly feel a lot more comfortable and a lot more knowledgeable now. But yeah, thank you for coming on and sharing that with us.
You're very welcome. As I say, I'm a woman on a mission to get people talking. So every opportunity, I'm there.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Midlife Men. I hope that Andrea has helped to dispel a few myths and provide new and useful insights, but also a few tools and techniques to help you with the women in your life. Her book, Could It Be Your Hormones, Love, is available to buy and download online, and you can visit her website, inherrightmind.com, for loads more useful information. I'll also put links in the episode description to all the other resources that Andrea referenced. If you have a suggestion for a topic you'd like us to cover in the podcast, or if you have a story you'd like to share, then please contact me either on Twitter @midlifemen or email me at midlifemen01@gmail.com. Join me next time when we talk to other midlife men about their stories, and maybe you'll find that they resonate with you. Thank you.